celebrate the development, while others are accusing the U.S.
In the early hours of a calm passage through contested waters, something impossible was supposed to remain impossible. No alarms, no warnings, no visible enemy. And yet, beneath the surface, a decision had already been made that could have rewritten the balance of naval power in a matter of minutes. According to this scenario, a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, a relic of Cold War thinking, quiet but aging, slipped into position and did what many analysts insist could never succeed. It allegedly targeted one of the most protected warships on Earth, USS Abraham Lincoln. For decades, aircraft carriers have been described as untouchable, floating fortresses surrounded by destroyers, submarines, aircraft, satellites, and sensors that see through darkness, depth, and deception. So the real question is not whether such an attack could happen, but what it would mean if it did. In this dramatized reconstruction, the submarine's commanders believed they had found a gap. A moment of silence in the noise of the ocean. A narrow window where legacy technology, patience, and human judgment might outplay algorithms and automation. One launch, one calculated risk, one chance to challenge the mythology of American naval dominance. What followed, however, tells a very different story. Within minutes, subtle anomalies appeared across the carrier strike group's sensor network. Acoustic patterns that did not belong, movements that did not match the ocean's natural rhythm. According to the scenario, the United States Navy reacted not with panic, but with precision. Layers of detection activated, data fused from sea, air, and space. The hunt began before the attacker realized it had been seen. 17 minutes later, the balance was already decided. This hypothetical engagement is often framed as a brutal comparison between eras. A submarine designed for a different century versus a fully networked, multi-domain force built for modern war. No dramatic dogfights. No heroic last stands. Just speed, coordination, and overwhelming awareness. But the consequences extend far beyond the waterline. In the narrative pushed by this scenario, the shockwaves reach Caracas almost instantly. Political leadership faces an uncomfortable reality. Symbolic power does not equal operational capability. Statements are issued. Rhetoric escalates. Behind closed doors, doubts emerge. Even Nicolas Maduro, in this telling, is forced to confront how fragile deterrence becomes when tested against real systems, real crews, and real response times. This is not a confirmed battle. There are no official reports, no public acknowledgements, no wreckage photos. What exists instead is a story, carefully constructed, emotionally charged, and designed to send a message. A message about what modern naval warfare looks like, about how quickly assumptions collapse under pressure, and about how some weapons are meant not to be used, but to remind everyone else why they shouldn't try. Tonight, we break down that scenario, what it claims happened, what it gets right, what it exaggerates, and what it reveals about power, perception, and the thin line between deterrence and disaster. Just before dawn, as the sea appeared calm and uneventful, a routine transit quietly turned into the opening moments of a story that would later be framed as one of the most provocative naval incidents of the decade. In this scenario, the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln was moving with its strike group through international waters, following a schedule that had been publicly known only in fragments and deliberately obscured in others. To the untrained eye, nothing was out of the ordinary. Flight operations were paused, escorts held standard formation, and the ocean surface revealed no sign of danger. Yet modern naval warfare rarely announces itself above the waves. According to the narrative, the first indication that something was wrong did not come from a blaring alarm or a sudden maneuver, but from silence. Sonar operators reportedly noticed the absence of expected background noise in a narrow corridor beneath the formation, an anomaly subtle enough to be dismissed under normal conditions. In recent years, diesel-electric submarines have exploited precisely this kind of acoustic ambiguity, relying on battery power and minimal movement to blend into the natural soundscape of the sea. While such platforms are widely considered outdated when compared to nuclear submarines, history has repeatedly shown that they can still pose a serious threat in confined or heavily trafficked waters. In this dramatized account, intelligence analysts would later claim that a Venezuelan submarine had been tracking the carrier strike group for several hours, using merchant traffic and thermal layers to mask its approach. Publicly available data confirms that similar tactics have been used by non-nuclear submarines in exercises and real-world patrols, particularly in regions where complex seabed geography interferes with long-range detection. What pushes this story into more speculative territory is the assertion that the submarine achieved a firing position without triggering immediate defensive responses, suggesting a momentary lapse in what is often described as an impenetrable surveillance bubble. The tension of the scenario lies in that narrow window of uncertainty. Aircraft carriers are not just symbols of power. They are central nodes in a web of sensors, escorts, and command systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of surprise. A single carrier strike group typically operates with destroyers equipped with advanced sonar arrays, airborne early warning aircraft, and its own anti-submarine helicopters. The idea that a hostile submarine could approach undetected challenges deeply ingrained assumptions about maritime dominance, which is precisely why this opening moment is so effective as a narrative hook. As the story is told, the submarine's crew believed they had identified a rare opportunity, one shaped by environmental conditions, timing, and overconfidence in established doctrines. Oceanographic data from the region, including temperature gradients and salinity shifts, is often cited to lend credibility to this claim, even though such data alone cannot confirm the presence or actions of any specific vessel. Still, these technical details give the scenario a sense of realism that blurs the line between plausible risk and outright fiction. What makes this introduction compelling is not the claim that an attack definitively occurred, but the implication that it could have. By framing the incident as a near miss rather than an outright failure or success, the narrative invites the audience to question how thin the margin truly is between routine operations and catastrophe. It also reinforces a recurring theme in modern military analysis: that technological superiority does not eliminate vulnerability, it merely reshapes it. In the first minutes of this hypothetical encounter, no missiles are launched, and no explosions break the surface. Instead, the threat exists as a possibility, detected only by specialists interpreting faint signals in a vast and indifferent ocean. This quiet tension sets the tone for everything that follows, transforming an ordinary transit into a dramatic confrontation between perception and reality, and reminding viewers that in naval warfare, the most dangerous moments often begin in complete silence. In this scenario, the focus quickly shifts from the carrier itself to the side portrayed as initiating the confrontation, and that is where the narrative becomes as political as it is military. Venezuela is framed not as a pure naval power, but as a state seeking relevance through asymmetry, symbolism, and calculated risk. In reality, Venezuela has long struggled with limited naval reach, aging platforms, and persistent maintenance issues, especially when compared to the blue water capabilities of major powers. This contrast is essential to the story being told, because it transforms the alleged incident into a tale of defiance rather than dominance. According to widely available defense assessments, Venezuela's navy is largely composed of surface vessels designed for coastal patrol, regional presence, and internal security rather than sustained power projection. Submarines, in this context, occupy a special symbolic role. They represent one of the few tools through which a materially weaker navy can challenge a technologically superior opponent without direct confrontation. The scenario leans heavily on this logic, suggesting that Venezuelan planners viewed a stealthy underwater platform as a political weapon first and a military one second. The narrative claims that the decision to deploy a submarine near a U.S. carrier strike group was driven by a combination of strategic messaging and internal pressure. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and economic strain are presented as background factors pushing Caracas toward demonstrative actions. While there is no public evidence of Venezuelan submarines operating anywhere near U.S. carrier routes in recent years, It is true that governments under pressure have historically used military gestures to signal resilience and resolve, even when the actual operational payoff is limited. In this dramatized version, the submarine and its crew are portrayed as operating on the edge of feasibility. Aging systems, limited spare parts, and shortened training cycles are acknowledged, but reframed as part of the tension. The implication is not that Venezuela possesses cutting-edge underwater warfare capabilities, but that it is willing to gamble with what it has. This portrayal aligns with a broader trope often used in military analysis: that outdated equipment becomes dangerous not when it is powerful, but when it is used unpredictably. Political leadership plays a central role in reinforcing this image. In the scenario, Nicolas Maduro is depicted as endorsing high-risk demonstrations intended to project strength abroad and unity at home. While such direct involvement is speculative, it reflects a real pattern in which military narratives are tied closely to political survival. The suggestion is that even a symbolic challenge to U.S. naval power could be framed domestically as proof that Venezuela remains defiant and capable of standing up to external pressure. At the same time, the scenario subtly acknowledges the imbalance at play. Venezuelan doctrine, as described in defense publications and exercises, emphasizes asymmetric defense, coastal denial, and psychological deterrence rather than direct engagement. The submarine, therefore, is not shown as part of a broader offensive campaign, but as a lone actor meant to test boundaries. This framing allows the story to remain plausible while amplifying the drama. A single platform, operating far from home, carrying the weight of national prestige. What is partially fictionalized is the level of confidence attributed to Venezuelan planners. The scenario suggests they believed modern U.S. defenses had grown complacent, overly reliant on automation and predictable patterns. While there is little evidence to support such an assessment, it serves an important narrative function by setting up a clash between perceived arrogance and harsh reality. The submarine's mission becomes a probe not just of defenses, but of assumptions. By portraying Venezuela as the initiator, the story establishes a clear contrast between intent and capability. It frames the alleged action as a deliberate challenge launched by a state aware of its limitations, but driven by political necessity and strategic theater. This sets the stage for the next phase of the narrative, where intention collides with response, and symbolism meets systems built for real-world combat. What follows in this scenario is the moment where intent turns into action, and speculation hardens into a sequence of events that defines the entire narrative. After the positioning and motivations already described, the alleged attack itself is presented not as a dramatic exchange of fire, but as a calculated attempt to test limits. In this telling, the submarine's crew committed to a single decisive move, based on the assumption that even a simulated or aborted strike would achieve its strategic purpose. The act itself is described as brief and precise, designed less to cause damage and more to prove proximity. This distinction matters, because it allows the story to claim plausibility without crossing into the territory of outright war. The implication is that the submarine's commanders believed that merely reaching a viable engagement envelope against USS Abraham Lincoln would be enough to shift perceptions, regardless of whether weapons were actually launched. In this reconstruction, the moment of action is almost anticlimactic. There are no explosions, no visible signs on the surface, only a sequence of internal decisions made under intense pressure. The submarine is said to have adjusted course and depth, briefly exposing itself to achieve optimal positioning. Analysts who support the scenario argue that this maneuver, rather than any specific weapon system, is what ultimately gave the submarine away. Even the most cautious movements, they note, can disrupt the surrounding environment just enough to leave a trace, especially when multiple detection systems are quietly watching the same space from different angles. This is where the narrative pivots sharply, shifting attention away from the attacker and toward the response. According to the scenario, the defensive reaction was neither immediate nor theatrical. Instead, it unfolded as a controlled escalation of awareness. Data streams that had previously been background noise were reclassified as relevant. patterns were cross-checked, if were weighted and re-weighted in real time. What is emphasized here is not speed alone, but coordination. The story highlights how modern naval defense is less about a single sensor or platform and more about the integration of dozens of them into a coherent picture. The response attributed to the United States Navy is framed as a textbook example of layered defense functioning exactly as intended. Surface escorts adjusted formation, airborne assets altered their patrol patterns, and undersea systems shifted from passive observation to active tracking. Some elements of this description align closely with publicly known doctrine and exercises, while others clearly drift into dramatization, particularly the claim that all of this occurred seamlessly within a rigid 17-minute window. The precise timing serves a narrative purpose, reinforcing the idea that the outcome was never truly in doubt once the threat was confirmed. As the story continues, the submarine is portrayed as realizing too late that the balance had shifted. The environment that once offered concealment becomes increasingly hostile, filled with signals and countermeasures that narrow its options. Here, the scenario leans on well-established principles of anti-submarine warfare, where detection often leads not to immediate destruction, but to progressive constraint. Escape routes shrink, decision cycles compress, and the margin for error disappears. The alleged neutralization of the submarine is described ambiguously, allowing the narrative to avoid technical scrutiny while still delivering a decisive conclusion. Whether through simulated engagement, forced withdrawal, or outright destruction, is left deliberately vague, reinforcing the idea that the symbolic outcome matters more than the physical details. The fifth phase of the narrative draws back from the tactical level and reframes the incident as a demonstration. The submarine's fate becomes a metaphor rather than an event, representing the collision between legacy platforms and modern networked warfare. The story argues that this was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a systems-level confrontation in which one side relied on isolation and surprise, while the other relied on redundancy and integration. The implication is that even well-handled older technology struggles to survive in an environment where every action is instantly contextualized within a broader operational picture. This framing is supported by selective references to historical exercises and past encounters, where smaller or less advanced forces achieved temporary successes but ultimately failed to alter strategic realities. By invoking these precedents without dwelling on them, the narrative positions the alleged incident as part of a longer trend rather than an anomaly. It suggests that the true lesson is not about a single submarine or carrier, but about the diminishing effectiveness of isolated challenges against fully integrated defense architectures. At the political level, the outcome is presented as reverberating far beyond the immediate operational sphere. The scenario claims that within hours, the implications were being debated in Caracas, where leadership faced the uncomfortable gap between intent and capability. While no direct statements are cited, the story portrays a climate of uncertainty and recalculation. Nicolas Maduro is mentioned not as a battlefield decision-maker, but as a figure confronting the strategic consequences of an action that failed to produce the desired psychological effect. What gives this combined section its force is the way it ties action, response, and outcome into a single arc. The alleged attack sets expectations, the defensive reaction dismantles them, and the final outcome reframes the entire episode as a cautionary tale. Even the fictionalized elements serve this structure, filling in emotional and temporal gaps without fundamentally altering the underlying message. That message is that modern naval power is less about individual platforms and more about the ecosystems they operate within. By the end of this phase, the viewer is left not with images of wreckage or victory, but with a sense of inevitability. The scenario suggests that once the line between observation and detection was crossed, the result was predetermined. In doing so, it reinforces a central theme of the overall narrative: that in contemporary warfare, the most decisive moments often occur invisibly, long before any public acknowledgement, and that challenges rooted in past doctrines struggle to survive contact with systems designed for a very different kind of fight. In the final phase of this scenario, Attention moves away from ships and sensors and toward consequences that are harder to measure, but far more enduring. What matters here is not what allegedly happened at sea, but how it was interpreted, amplified, and absorbed at the political and psychological level. As mentioned earlier, the operational outcome itself was ambiguous by design, yet its informational impact was anything but. Within hours, the story began to circulate in analytical circles, unofficial briefings, and media ecosystems that thrive on strategic symbolism. The absence of confirmation did little to slow its spread. In fact, it made the narrative more adaptable, allowing different audiences to project their own conclusions onto the same set of claims. In Caracas, the scenario portrays a leadership confronted with an uncomfortable reassessment. Even without public acknowledgement, internal discussions are said to have shifted tone. The premise that proximity alone could translate into deterrence was now in question. According to the narrative, senior officials quietly acknowledged that symbolic gestures lose much of their power when the opposing side controls escalation at every level. Nicolas Maduro is depicted not as reacting with open panic, but with visible frustration at the gap between intended messaging and perceived outcome. This distinction is important because it reframes panic not as chaos, but as strategic anxiety, the realization that a carefully calculated signal failed to land as expected. Psychologically, the incident is framed as asymmetrical in effect. For domestic audiences within Venezuela, the story could be selectively presented as evidence of defiance, regardless of technical details. The mere suggestion that a Venezuelan asset reached a position of relevance against a U.S. carrier could be framed as validation of resistance and sovereignty. This aligns with well-documented patterns in information management, where ambiguity is leveraged to maintain morale and political cohesion. At the same time, the scenario suggests that within professional military circles, the interpretation was far less forgiving. The difference between symbolic proximity and operational survivability became impossible to ignore. On the opposite side, the political impact in Washington is portrayed as muted but confident. The lack of public reaction is itself treated as a message. By declining to acknowledge the event, U.S. leadership reinforces the idea that the episode did not rise to the level of strategic concern. Analysts quoted in the scenario argue that silence, in this context, functions as deterrence. It denies validation to the initiator while quietly reaffirming trust in existing defense architectures. This approach is consistent with historical precedent, where overwhelming superiority is often communicated through restraint rather than escalation. Beyond the two capitals, the broader international signal is perhaps the most significant. Regional actors are said to have taken note, not of the alleged attempt itself, but of how quickly it was neutralized within the narrative framework. For smaller states and non-peer actors, the takeaway is sobering. Modern power is less visible, less dramatic, and far less forgiving of experimentation. The scenario implies that even when an action generates headlines or speculation, it may simultaneously reinforce the very hierarchies it was meant to challenge. In its closing implication, the story returns to psychology rather than hardware. Deterrence, it argues, is no longer built solely on fear of destruction, but on predictability of outcome. When response times are measured in minutes and decision-making is distributed across networks rather than individuals, the space for symbolic provocation narrows dramatically. The alleged incident, whether viewed as cautionary tale or propaganda exercise, ultimately serves as a reminder that in the modern strategic environment, perception is a battlefield of its own, and not every challenge produces the psychological shock its authors intended.